Coffee spilled across the red-checkered tablecloth as steel handcuffs snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. A quiet Thursday afternoon at a small-town diner shattered the moment an arrogant sheriff decided to humiliate a distinguished stranger over a simple lunch. He thought he was putting an outsider in his place. He had no idea the calm, soft-spoken man in the tailored Navy suit was a sitting United States federal judge. And in less than an hour, one single phone call would bring his entire corrupt kingdom crashing down around him. The town of Millhaven Ridge sat deep in the pine hills of eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the highway narrowed to 2 cracked lanes, and the welcome sign had been rusting since before most of its residents were born. Its main street was a strip of fading brick storefronts, a hardware store that hadn't changed its window display in a decade, and one constantly humming neon sign above a place called Dot's Diner. To passing travelers, Millhaven Ridge was nothing more than a speed trap between 2 bigger cities. To Sheriff Duane Kessler, it was an empire, and he had ruled it for 11 years the way a warlord rules a border town. Through fear, through favors, and through the absolute certainty that no one in Millhaven would ever dare stand up to him. On this particular Thursday, a thick, suffocating heat pressed against the diner's front windows. Inside, a window unit rattled and wheezed, losing its battle against the Tennessee summer 1 degree at a time. In the corner booth, bathed in the dusty afternoon light, sat the Honorable Marcus A. Whitfield. Judge Whitfield was a man in his early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes only from decades of sitting above other people's chaos and never once losing his composure. Appointed to the United States District Court 18 years earlier, his days were usually swallowed by gavels, sealed indictments, and the crushing weight of decisions that changed lives. Today, though, he was simply a man on a long drive, cutting through the hills on his way to visit his son at college 3 states over. He'd taken the back roads on a whim, wanting quiet before the noise of another semester's paperwork began. He wore a perfectly tailored Navy suit, a sharp contrast to the faded overalls and grease-stained caps of the diner's regulars. A half-eaten Reuben sandwich sat on his plate. Beside it, a stack of case files waited, his reading glasses resting on top like a paperweight, holding down a small mountain of other people's futures. The bell above the diner door jangled violently, cutting through the low murmur of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. Sheriff Duane Kessler swaggered in, trailed by his shadow, a younger, visibly nervous deputy named Cole Bannister. Kessler was built like a slab of granite poured into a uniform 2 sizes too tight across the chest. His brass star was polished to a blinding shine, the kind of shine that says, "I want you to see this before you see my face." He'd run Millhaven Ridge for over a decade, with the backing of his old fishing buddy, Mayor Gareth Pruitt, and a town council too frightened of him to ask a single hard question. Kessler didn't walk into a room, he occupied it. As he moved down the aisle, he greeted the locals in a booming voice that demanded a response whether you wanted to give one or not. He slapped a rancher on the back, hard enough to spill his coffee. He snatched a fry off a teenager's plate, without asking. He shot the waitress, behind the counter, a wink so unwelcome she visibly flinched. He owned this room, and he wanted every single person in it to feel that ownership in their bones. Then his eyes landed on the corner booth. Kessler stopped chewing his gum mid-motion. His gaze went hard and flat, the way a dog's does right before it decides whether to bark or bite. In Millhaven Ridge, strangers were already treated with suspicion. But a black man in a suit that likely cost more than Kessler made in a month, sitting alone, calmly reading legal documents in his town. That wasn't just a stranger. To Duane Kessler, that was a provocation. "Cole," Kessler muttered, not taking his eyes off Whitfield. "Who's the high roller?" Deputy Bannister shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his duty belt like it had suddenly gotten too tight. "Don't know, Sheriff. Saw his car out front Nice sedan, out-of-state plates. Looks like he's just passing through. Having lunch is all. Passing through, Kessler repeated, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops. Nobody just passes through my town without saying hello to the law. Look at him. Suit like that, in this heat. That's not a tourist. That's a con man, or one of those big city agitators come sniffing around. Sheriff, he's just eating, Bannister said quietly, a note of pleading creeping into his voice. He'd seen Kessler's moods before, and they never ended well for whoever was standing in front of him. Kessler ignored him completely. His boots echoed heavy and deliberate across the linoleum as he changed direction and marched straight for Whitfield's booth. The chatter in the diner died instantly. Regulars stared down into their coffee cups, suddenly fascinated by the bottoms of their mugs. They all knew better than to watch the sheriff work. Judge Whitfield heard the footsteps coming. He didn't look up right away. He had spent decades studying human behavior, in and out of a courtroom, and he recognized the rhythm of a bully closing in on a target. He deliberately kept his eyes on the page in front of him, turned it with a soft rustle, and projected nothing but unbothered calm. Kessler stopped at the edge of the table, letting his shadow fall across the documents like a curtain. Afternoon, Kessler barked. The word carried no warmth at all. Whitfield finished his sentence, marked his place with a slim silver pen, and looked up. His dark eyes were sharp, patient, and entirely without fear. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was a deep, even baritone. "Can I help you, officer?" That's sheriff to you. Kessler leaned two thick hands onto the table's edge, invading the space in front of Whitfield like he had every right to it. "Sheriff Duane Kessler. I don't recall seeing you around Millhaven Ridge before, friend. I'm not from around here, Sheriff," Whitfield said calmly, folding his reading glasses. "Just stopping for a meal. The Reuben is excellent, if you're curious." Kessler didn't smile. His eyes dropped to the legal documents, recognizing the format, but not the dense language filling the pages. "What's all this, then? You selling something? We got strict rules about soliciting in this county." "I'm not soliciting," Whitfield replied, lifting his coffee cup. "These are private materials. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish my lunch in peace." The dismissal was polite. It was also unmistakably an order, and it carried a weight of quiet authority that Kessler had never once heard from anyone, let alone a stranger sitting in a booth in his own diner. The back of Kessler's neck flushed red. "I don't like your tone," he growled, his voice dropping an octave. "I asked you a question. What's your business in my town?" Whitfield took a slow sip of coffee, set the mug precisely back on its coaster, and met Kessler's glare without blinking. "My business, Sheriff, is eating a sandwich. Dining in a public establishment isn't a crime in this state, last I checked." Behind Kessler, Deputy Bannister felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. The stranger wasn't backing down. He was speaking to the sheriff the way a teacher corrects a misbehaving child, with patience and with the unmistakable sense that he was the only adult in the room. "ID," Kessler snapped, thrusting out a meaty palm. The diner went dead silent. The only sound left was the rattle of the window unit, fighting a war it was never going to win. Judge Whitfield didn't reach for his pocket. He didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, radiating a kind of dangerous, deliberate patience. "Sheriff Kessler," he said evenly. "Under what suspicion are you demanding my identification? Have I committed a crime? Am I suspected of one? Or am I, in your judgment, about to commit one?" Kessler blinked, caught off guard by the precision of the question. "I'm the sheriff of this county. I don't need a reason to know who's sitting in my town." "Hand over the license." "Actually, you do need a reason," Whitfield corrected, his voice carrying clean across the silent room. "Under the Fourth Amendment, and as the Supreme Court made clear in Terry v. Ohio, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime is afoot before you can compel identification from a citizen. Eating a sandwich does not meet that standard. I respectfully decline." Kessler's face went from red to a deep, dangerous crimson. The legal language landed on him like a slap. The other patrons were frozen, watching, barely breathing. Kessler's authority, the entire foundation of his existence in this town, was being calmly, methodically taken apart by a man who hadn't raised his voice once. "You a lawyer or something?" Kessler spat, his hand dropping to rest on the grip of his sidearm, an intimidation move that had worked 100 times before on 100 lesser men. Whitfield's eyes flicked to the hand on the gun. He filed it away. "Something like that," he said. "Which means I am very aware of my rights. I'd suggest you step back, Sheriff, before you cross the line into harassment." "Harassment?" Kessler barked a short, ugly laugh, glancing back at Bannister. "You hear this, Cole? He thinks I'm harassing him." He turned back, leaning in until Whitfield could smell stale coffee and chewing tobacco on his breath. "Listen close, Slick. Wherever you crawled out from, maybe you can talk back to a badge there. Out here, my word is the law. Give me your ID, or you're going in for obstruction and disorderly conduct." Whitfield exhaled softly, the sigh of a man who dealt with fools professionally, though usually from an elevated bench with a gavel in his hand and a court reporter typing every word. He could have ended it right there. Reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his federal credentials, and watched the color drain out of this man's face in real time. But as he studied Kessler, something else occurred to him. If this man was willing to do this to a well-dressed stranger in a crowded diner over nothing but wounded pride, what was he doing to the poor, the young, the powerless people of this town who had no money for lawyers and no idea what a Fourth Amendment even was? Judge Whitfield made a decision in that fraction of a second. Sheriff Kessler didn't just need a lesson in the law. He needed a lesson in consequences. "I will not be providing identification," Whitfield said, his voice ringing with quiet finality, "because your demand is unlawful, and I am not being disorderly. I am simply refusing to comply with an illegal order." "Stand up!" Kessler roared, all pretense of control gone. He lunged forward, grabbed a fistful of Whitfield's lapel, and hauled him bodily out of the booth. The coffee cup toppled, sending a brown river across the tablecloth and dripping onto the floor. Whitfield didn't struggle. He kept his hands loose and visible, offering Kessler no excuse whatsoever to claim resistance. "You're under arrest!" Kessler bellowed, spinning Whitfield around and slamming him chest-first into the diner's front window. The glass rattled in its frame. Sheriff Bannister stepped forward, panic flooding his face. "Sheriff, wait, we don't even." "Shut up, Cole, and give me your cuffs." Bannister fumbled at his belt, hands shaking, and produced a pair of steel handcuffs. Kessler snatched them, yanked Whitfield's wrists behind his back, and cinched them down hard enough to bite into skin. "You are making a grave mistake, Sheriff," Whitfield said, his cheek pressed against the warm glass, voice still eerily calm. "The only one making a mistake is you, boy," Kessler hissed into his ear, the slur deliberate, meant to wound. "You come into my town. You disrespect my badge. You pay for it. You're gonna spend the night in a cell and see how much you feel like quoting the Constitution to the rats." He dragged Whitfield toward the exit by the arm. The bell jingled cheerfully overhead, a grotesque contrast to the tension crackling through the room as they stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. Whitfield glanced back over his shoulder at the trembling deputy. "Note the time, Deputy Bannister. 12:51 p.m., unlawful detention, false arrest, excessive force, deprivation of rights under color of law." Bannister swallowed hard, his face draining of color. Something twisted deep in his gut. The man in the cuffs wasn't acting like a criminal. He wasn't acting scared either. He was acting like a man holding every card in the deck, patiently waiting for the moment to lay them down. "Keep walking," Kessler snarled, shoving Whitfield toward the waiting cruiser. The back seat smelled of stale beer, old sweat, and industrial disinfectant, separated from the front, by a scratched plexiglass divider. Kessler shoved Whitfield down onto the hard plastic bench and slammed the door with a bang that rattled the whole car. Whitfield shifted, hands bound tight behind him, the awkward angle already straining his shoulders and threatening the seams of his jacket. He took a slow breath and centered himself. In his mind, he was no longer a man being kidnapped by a rogue officer of the law. He was already presiding over the case, cataloging every violation as it happened. No probable cause, excessive force, no Miranda warning, clear and documented malicious intent. Kessler dropped into the driver's seat, the whole car groaning under his weight. Bannister climbed in beside him, silent, eyes fixed on the dashboard, fingers wound tight around his radio cord. The cruiser peeled away from the diner with a deliberate screech. "You're awfully quiet back there now, counselor," Kessler taunted, watching Whitfield in the rearview mirror. "Lost that smart mouth, or you finally figured out you ain't the smartest man in the room no more." Whitfield met his eyes in the mirror, calm and unblinking. "I'm simply observing, Sheriff. When a man is determined to dig his own grave, it's best not to interrupt him." Kessler snorted. "Got a mouth on you, I'll give you that. But out here, smart mouths don't get you far. Fancy suit, big words, none of that means a thing in Millhaven Ridge. Out here, the law is whatever I say it is." "That is a dangerous philosophy, Sheriff," Whitfield said, his voice echoing faintly in the cramped cab. "And historically, an unsustainable one. The law exists precisely to protect citizens from men who think exactly the way you do. A badge is a public trust. It was never meant to be a license for cruelty." Save the lecture. Kessler took a hard turn, throwing Whitfield sideways against the door. "You're getting booked for resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and failure to identify. You'll sit in holding till I decide you're ready for the magistrate. And trust me, Judge Larson and I go way back. He won't be rushing to see you." Whitfield almost smiled at the mention of the local magistrate. Layer after layer of this town's corruption was peeling back like old paint. "I look forward to meeting this Judge Larson," he said softly. They arrived at the Millhaven Ridge Sheriff's Department 10 minutes later, a squat cinder-block building with barred windows, sitting at the edge of town beside a sun-bleached impound lot. Kessler hauled Whitfield out by the cuffs and dragged him through the rear entrance, the asphalt radiating heat like an open oven. Bannister trailed behind, carrying Whitfield's leather folio of case files like it might detonate in his hands. Inside, under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights, the booking area was small and cluttered, a battered metal desk bolted to the floor, and behind it, a bored dispatcher named Rhonda, who barely looked up from her crossword. "Got a live one, Rhonda," Kessler announced loudly, shoving Whitfield toward the desk. "John Doe. Refused to identify, resisted arrest. Book him, put him in cell 2. Rhonda spun her chair around slowly, and her eyes widened just slightly at the sight of Whitfield's immaculate suit and unshaken bearing. It wasn't often someone walked into this room looking like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. "Empty his pockets," Kessler ordered Bannister. The young deputy stepped forward, hands still trembling. "Sir, I need to search your pockets," he said, his voice painfully polite next to his boss's bark. "Proceed, deputy," Whitfield permitted, standing perfectly still. Bannister pulled a silver money clip from the left pocket, a smartphone from the right, and finally, from the inner breast pocket, a slim, dark leather wallet. His thumb brushed the edge. He began to open it. "Don't even look at it yet," Kessler snapped, snatching the wallet out of his hand and tossing it onto the desk with a loud smack. "I want him in the cell first. I want him sitting in the dark, smelling the mildew, for an hour before I even bother caring what his name is. Strip his jacket, take his belt and his shoelaces. Sheriff, standard procedure says we log the ID first, to establish," Bannister started. "I write the procedures around here, Cole." Kessler's roar made Rhonda jump in her chair. "Do what I told you." Whitfield watched the wallet land on the desk, inches from Kessler's elbow. Inside that leather fold sat a gold federal badge and a heavy, embossed identification card signed by the Chief Justice of the United States. Kessler had just thrown away his very last chance. "Before you place me in a cell," Whitfield said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "I am legally entitled to one phone call. For your own sake, Sheriff, I'd suggest you allow it." Kessler laughed and stepped in close, right into Whitfield's face. "You're not in the movies, pal. You get your call when I finish processing you, and I'm not finishing anything until after my lunch. So you're going to sit in cell 2 and think real hard about how you talk to the sheriff of Millhaven Ridge." Bannister reluctantly stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs just long enough to peel off Whitfield's jacket before recuffing him tightly under Kessler's watchful glare. He unbuckled the belt. He pulled the laces from a pair of handmade Oxford shoes. Through all of it, Whitfield never lost an ounce of dignity. He didn't curse. He didn't beg. He looked at Kessler with something closer to pity than fear. "Very well," Whitfield said, as Bannister marched him toward the heavy steel door of the holding block. "But you should know, Sheriff, when I make that call, this building will not be the same by the time I hang up." Kessler waved him off, already turning back toward the break room. "Lock him up, Cole." The steel door clanged shut, the sound rolling down the concrete hallway like a slow, final drumbeat. Sheriff Duane Kessler felt, in that moment, like a king who had just crushed a rebellion. He strutted to the desk, dropped into a chair, propped his boots up beside the confiscated wallet, and had absolutely no idea that the clock on his entire career had just struck 0. The station settled into an uneasy quiet. In the back, on the cold steel bench of cell 2, Judge Marcus Whitfield sat without pacing, without shouting for a lawyer. He simply closed his eyes and began, calmly, methodically, drafting in his mind the federal filings he was about to unleash on this town. Out in the bullpen, Kessler was entirely unbothered. He kicked his boots off the desk, wandered into the break room, and a moment later, the smell of microwave chili drifted through the station, like nothing in the world was wrong. Deputy Bannister stayed frozen at the booking desk, his stomach twisted into knots. The air conditioner hummed uselessly overhead. Rhonda popped her gum and scribbled another answer into her crossword. 7 letters for impending doom, she muttered to herself. Bannister didn't answer. His eyes kept drifting to the wallet, sitting exactly where Kessler had thrown it. Something about the man in that cell was wrong. Terrifyingly wrong. Criminals yelled. They panicked. They begged, or they fought. They did not calmly cite Supreme Court precedent while being manhandled through a diner. They did not issue quiet, level warnings about a point of no return and mean every word of it. "Rhonda," Bannister whispered, his voice cracking. "Did you see that suit? That wasn't off any rack. That was tailored." Rhonda didn't look up. "He's a talker, Cole. Duane eats talkers for breakfast. Now quit sweating on my desk. You're making me nervous." But Bannister couldn't stop. His gaze kept crawling back to that wallet. Procedure said all property had to be logged and inventoried immediately. Kessler had told him not to look, but Kessler was currently elbow-deep in a bowl of chili, laughing at a rerun in the next room. His fingers trembled as he reached out and picked it up. The leather was smooth, expensive, heavier than it had any right to be. Too heavy for cash and credit cards alone. He flipped it open. His breath caught and froze solid in his chest. He'd expected a driver's license, maybe a business card. Instead, the fluorescent light caught the unmistakable gleam of a solid gold badge, deep set into the leather. Not a standard shield, but a cast eagle gripping the arrows of justice, bearing the seal of the United States. Beside it, behind a thick pane of protective plastic, sat a federal identification card. The name was printed in bold black ink. Marcus A. Whitfield. And below that, the title that drained every drop of color from Deputy Cole Bannister's face, United States District Judge. His eyes darted across the seal of the federal judiciary, across the signature of the Chief Justice of the United States, across an appointment date stretching back nearly 2 decades. This wasn't a lawyer. This wasn't a local politician throwing his weight around. This was an Article 3 federal judge, a man with the literal authority of the United States government behind him, a man who could sign warrants, summon the FBI, and, if he chose to, bring the entire machinery of federal law enforcement crashing down on a single county sheriff's department in a single phone call. Bannister's hands shook so badly, the wallet nearly slipped from his fingers. "Sheriff," he croaked, though no sound came out loud enough to carry. He tried again, louder this time, his voice cracking down the middle. "Sheriff, Sheriff, you need to see this. Right now." Kessler appeared in the doorway, a spoon of chili halfway to his mouth, irritation stamped across his face. "This better be good, Cole. I'm eating my—" Bannister held the wallet out with both trembling hands, like it was made of glass. "Sheriff, he's a federal judge." The spoon clattered to the floor. Kessler crossed the room in 3 heavy strides and snatched the wallet, staring at the gold badge, the seal, the signature, the title, as if his eyes were lying to him. His face went through 3 colors in 5 seconds, red, then gray, then a sickly, sweating white. That can't. His voice came out smaller than either of them had ever heard it. "That's fake. Has to be fake." "Sheriff, that's not fake," Bannister said, backing away slightly, like the wallet itself might explode. "Look at the seal. Look at the signature. That's the Chief Justice. Sheriff, we have a sitting federal judge handcuffed in cell 2. Somewhere down the concrete hallway, muffled but perfectly clear, Judge Whitfield's voice carried through the steel door. "I believe, gentlemen, this would be an excellent time to allow that phone call." Kessler's jaw worked silently. For the first time in 11 years, Sheriff Duane Kessler had absolutely nothing to say. He should have opened that cell door immediately. He should have gone in, uncuffed the man himself, apologized, and prayed it would be enough. Every rational bone in his body screamed at him to do exactly that. But rage and pride are a poison that doesn't clear from the blood easily, and Kessler has had swallowed gallons of both over 11 years of never once being told no. So, instead of walking back to that cell with his head bowed, he did the one thing that would guarantee his own destruction. He panicked, and then he doubled down. "Nobody touches that phone," Kessler barked, snatching the station's landline off its cradle and yanking the cord clean out of the wall. He then rounded on Bannister, jabbing a finger into his chest. "You didn't see anything. That wallet is empty. You hear me? We fix this quiet. We let him cool off. We cut him loose in an hour. We tell him it was a misunderstanding, and this never leaves this building. Sheriff, you can't just—" "I can do whatever I want. This is my department," Kessler roared, spit flying, veins bulging in his neck. He shoved Bannister backward into the desk hard enough to knock over Rhonda's coffee mug. "You want a career in law enforcement, Cole? You learn right now that loyalty comes before everything. Everything. You breathe one word about this to anyone, I will bury you." Rhonda had gone very still, very quiet, her crossword forgotten, her eyes wide with the particular fear of someone who has just watched her boss step off a cliff and is trying to decide whether to jump after him or run. Bannister's hands were shaking, but something in his face had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something else was starting to burn. Kessler stormed off toward the holding block, boots pounding the concrete, and yanked open the small viewing slot in the steel door. Inside, Judge Whitfield sat exactly as he's had for the last 40 minutes. Calm, composed, hands folded in his lap despite the cuffs, as though he were waiting for a delayed flight rather than sitting in a filthy holding cell. "I understand you've discovered my identity, Sheriff," Whitfield said without turning his head. "I trust you're beginning to grasp the severity of your situation. You think that badge scares me?" Kessler snarled through the slot, though his voice cracked on the last word, betraying every ounce of the terror underneath. "You're still in my jail. You're still in my county. I can hold you on that resisting charge for 24 hours. Easy. And by the time anybody comes looking, I'll have my story straight." Whitfield finally turned his head, and his eyes, calm and terrible, found Kessler's through the narrow slot. "Sheriff Kessler," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something with complete clarity, because I suspect it is the last piece of free legal counsel you will ever receive from me. Unlawful detention of a federal judge is not a misdemeanor you can paper over with a false report. It is a federal crime. Deprivation of rights under color of law, kidnapping under federal statute, obstruction of justice. These are not county charges, Sheriff. These are charges that will be prosecuted in a federal courthouse by federal attorneys in front of a federal jury. You are not holding a stranger in your jail. You are holding a hostage, and you have exactly one window left to make this less catastrophic for yourself than it is about to become." Kessler's hand tightened white-knuckled on the edge of the slot. For one long suspended moment, something almost like reason flickered behind his eyes. Then his pride slammed the door on it. Windows closed, Kessler spat and shut the slot with a metal clang that echoed like a verdict down the empty hallway. He turned and stalked back toward the front of the station, and found Deputy Bannister standing at the booking desk, holding the landline's severed cord in one hand and his own personal cell phone in the other, his thumb hovering over the screen. The two men locked eyes. "Put it down, Cole," Kessler said, low and dangerous, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Sheriff." Bannister's voice shook, but he didn't move. "I took an oath, not to you, to the badge. And what you're doing back there, that's not the badge anymore. That's just you," I said. "Put it down." Bannister's thumb pressed the screen. 3 states away, at a regional field office humming quietly on a Thursday afternoon, a phone lit up on the desk of Special Agent in Charge Renata Vasquez of the FBI. She glanced at the unfamiliar number, considered letting it roll to voicemail, and then, for reasons she would later call instinct, picked it up. "This better be worth my lunch break," she said. The voice on the other end was young, badly shaken, and talking too fast. "Ma'am, this is Deputy Cole Bannister, Millhaven Ridge County Sheriff's Department. I need to report it that my sheriff has a United States District Judge illegally detained in our holding cell, and he just ripped the phone out of the wall so the judge can't make his call. And I think, ma'am, he's about to do something a lot worse if somebody doesn't get here fast." Vasquez was already standing, already reaching for her jacket. "Say that judge's name." "Whitfield. Marcus Whitfield. His ID says Federal District Judge, signed by the Chief Justice." The pen dropped from her other hand. "Deputy," Vasquez said, her voice gone flat and razor-sharp, "do not let anyone touch that man again. Do you understand me? Nobody lays another hand on him. Help is coming." She hung up and was already shouting down the hallway before the call had fully disconnected. "I need a tactical team wheels up in 10 minutes. We have a sitting federal judge kidnapped by a county sheriff in Millhaven Ridge, Tennessee. Move, move." Back in Kessler's station, the sheriff had turned his fury fully onto Bannister now, closing the distance between them in 2 furious strides, his hand dropping to rest, not quite drawing, but resting, a threat all its own, on the grip of his sidearm. "You just made the worst mistake of your entire life, boy," Kessler hissed. "No, Sheriff," Bannister said, and for the first time all day, his voice didn't shake. "I think I just made the only decision I've made all year that I'm going to be proud of." For nearly 40 agonizing minutes, the station sat in a silence so thick it felt physical. Kessler paced. Rhonda stared at her crossword without writing a single word. Bannister stood near the front door like a sentry, watching the empty road outside, praying he hadn't just called for help that would arrive too late. Then, in the distance, faint at first, and then unmistakable, came the low thrum of rotor blades. Kessler froze mid-stride. The sound grew, swelled, became a roar, and then black SUVs were screaming into the parking lot in a tight, practiced formation, doors flying open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Tactical agents in body armor poured out, weapons up, moving with the terrifying precision of people who had done this 100 times and intended to do it perfectly this time too. Kessler's hand shot toward his sidearm on pure animal instinct. Hands. Show me your hands. Get on the ground. Now. The voice belonged to Sac Vasquez herself, striding through the door at the head of 6 agents, her weapon trained dead center on Kessler's chest. Kessler's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand froze halfway to his holster, and in that instant, every ounce of the swagger that had carried him through 11 years of unchecked power evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a very large, very frightened man, standing alone in the middle of his own station. On the ground! On the ground right now! Vasquez roared, and this time Kessler's knees buckled on their own, dropping him hard onto the cold tile floor as 2 agents descended, wrenching his arms behind his back and cuffing him with the exact steel handcuffs he had used on Whitfield not 2 hours earlier. "Where is he?" Vasquez demanded. Not a question, an order. "Cell 2, Bannister said, already moving, keys jangling in his shaking hand. "This way, ma'am. Please, this way." The steel door swung open, and there, sitting exactly as calm as he had been for the last hour, was Judge Marcus Whitfield, rising slowly to his feet as the agents rushed to remove his cuffs. "Your Honor." Vasquez's voice cracked with something between relief and fury. "Are you hurt?" "I'm uninjured, Agent," Whitfield said, rolling his shoulders, working the stiffness out. "Thank you for the prompt response. I trust the medic outside is a formality, rather than a necessity." "We'd still like you checked, sir." "Standard procedure." Whitfield allowed himself a small nod, then turned his gaze toward the front room, where Kessler was being patted down and stripped of his badge and weapon by 2 federal marshals who had just arrived. "What about him, Your Honor?" Vasquez asked. Whitfield walked slowly toward the front of the station, every step measured, unhurried, inevitable. Kessler was on his knees now, face pale, sweat pouring down his temples, all that granite bravado gone, replaced by something small and pathetic and, at long last, afraid. "Sheriff Duane Kessler," Whitfield said clearly, making certain his words landed on every body camera now recording in the room. "You are under arrest for federal kidnapping, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. I will personally be in contact with the United States Attorney's Office within the hour to begin drafting your indictment." Kessler's head hung low, his breathing ragged. "Please," he whispered, so quietly, only Whitfield and the marshals holding him could hear it. "Please, Your Honor. I didn't know. I didn't." "That," Whitfield said without a trace of anger, "only a bottomless, chilling disappointment, is precisely the problem, Sheriff. You didn't need to know who I was to know that what you were doing was wrong. You needed to know that 11 years ago. You chose every single day since not to." He turned his gaze down to Deputy Bannister, who stood near the doorway, still holding the phone he'd used to call for help, tears streaking silently down his face. As for the deputy, Whitfield continued, his tone softening. He acted under direct coercion from his superior, and it was his courage, in the end, that ended this. "I'd suggest leniency, provided he continues to cooperate fully with the federal investigation into this county's practices." "Understood, Your Honor," Vasquez said. "We already have warrants being drafted for the mayor and the local magistrate. We're going to tear this county's records apart." Whitfield nodded once, reaching for his suit jacket, where it had been draped over a chair, sliding his arms into the sleeves and reclaiming, in one smooth motion, all the composure he had never truly lost. "Good," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "Let's make sure Millhaven Ridge finally learns what the law actually means." He walked out through the front doors into the blazing Tennessee sun, leaving behind the wreckage of a fallen empire. The collapse that followed was not slow, it was total. By nightfall, the Millhaven Ridge County Sheriff's Department had been fully taken over by the FBI. Local news vans arrived first, and by morning, national networks had followed, satellite trucks clogging the same cracked Main Street where Kessler had once strutted like a king. The story of a rogue small-town sheriff kidnapping a sitting United States district judge became a national firestorm that no press release could contain. Federal forensic accountants and civil rights investigators tore through Kessler's files and found a decade-long enterprise of extortion, false imprisonment, and outright theft. Kessler hadn't just been bullying the occasional tourist. He and Mayor Gareth Pruitt had been running an illegal civil forfeiture scheme, systematically targeting minorities and out-of-state drivers, seizing their cash and vehicles to line their own pockets under the false cover of law enforcement. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division released a blistering public statement, calling the Millhaven Ridge case a textbook example of systemic local corruption and vowing full prosecution for everyone involved. Within 2 weeks, Mayor Pruitt and Magistrate Judge Harold Larson were both dragged out of their homes in handcuffs, indicted on federal racketeering charges and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. Duane Kessler's trial, held 6 months later in the marble halls of the federal courthouse 2 hours away, was a masterclass in public humiliation. Stripped of his polished star, his tailored uniform, and every last shred of his booming arrogance, Kessler sat at the defense table in a shapeless orange jumpsuit that hung off a frame that had lost nearly 30 pounds. His posture, once so proud, was perpetually hunched now, as though the weight of the federal government itself pressed down on his shoulders every single day. Deputy Cole Bannister, having accepted a plea deal in exchange for his full cooperation, took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. His testimony was devastating, a careful, detailed account of the culture of fear Kessler had built over 11 years, the illegal stops, the intimidation, and finally, the precise, terrifying events inside Dot's diner and the county jail. Then the prosecution called their final witness, the Honorable Marcus A. Whitfield. When Judge Whitfield entered the courtroom, the entire gallery fell into absolute silence. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and moved with the same unhurried, dignified grace he had carried through the diner and the holding cell alike. He took the oath, sat in the witness box, and recounted the events with such precise, surgical detail that Kessler's expensive defense attorney had nothing left to work with inside of 20 minutes. Whitfield never once raised his voice. He expressed no anger at all, only a deep, quiet, devastating disappointment in a man who had taken an oath to protect people and used it instead as a weapon against them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Duane Kessler guilty on every count: kidnapping, aggravated assault, and multiple violations of federal civil rights statutes. Presiding federal judge Eleanor H. Ransom showed him no mercy at sentencing. She looked down from the very bench Kessler had once mocked and delivered words that would be quoted in legal journals for years to come. "Mr. Kessler," her voice ringing like a struck bell through the silent courtroom, "you built a fiefdom of terror and called it a police department. You took the sacred trust the public placed in that badge and used it as a weapon to feed your own bigotry and greed. It is a genuinely terrifying thing to consider how many voiceless people you destroyed long before you ever made the mistake of targeting a man with the power to stop you." The gavel came down. "I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Kessler collapsed back into his chair, sobbing openly into his cuffed hands, the sound echoing through a courtroom that offered him not 1 ounce of sympathy in return. The justice that followed was swift, and it was thorough. Kessler was transferred to a maximum security federal facility, where the man who had once demanded total submission from an entire county now found himself at the very bottom of a hierarchy he no longer controlled, scrubbing the same kind of cold concrete floors he had once thrown innocent people onto without a second thought. Deputy Cole Bannister left law enforcement entirely, changed forever by what he'd witnessed and by the quiet grace Judge Whitfield had shown him. Despite everything, he moved 2 states away and took a quiet job managing a logistics warehouse. On his desk, he kept a small framed copy of the United States Constitution, a daily reminder of the day he had very nearly lost himself, and of the judge who had given him the chance to find his way back. As for Judge Marcus Whitfield, he returned to his chambers the following Monday, sat down at his heavy oak desk, put on his reading glasses, and opened a new case file, exactly as he had done 10,000 times before. Justice, he knew, was never a destination you finally arrived at. It was a daily, exhausting battle that demanded constant vigilance from anyone willing to fight it. But as he lifted his coffee cup that morning, a small, quiet smile touched the corners of his mouth. The scales, at least for today, were balanced once more.